Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. For those of you who are new, my name is Emmanuel. Hope you guys are having an amazing Easter celebration, right? So in today's video, we're going to be learning about programmatic UI. And to be honest with you, the first time I got exposed to this, it was actually really terrifying. Like everything just looked super difficult. Now my goal today is to make sure that you don't have that same experience. So I'm going to try as much as possible to keep things simple, and hopefully in a few days, you will become a programmatic UI lord, all right? So let's actually just jump right into it. And so first thing we're going to do is head over to the storyboard. So let's actually go through the processes we go through to implement a design. Now we are in our storyboard. This is our view. The first thing we want to do if we want to add maybe a label to the view is we click on this plus button, we scroll through, we see whatever we want to add. So in our case, a label, we click and we drag it to a specific position. And let's say maybe here in the center if we want to. And then we go ahead and add some constraints, maybe center vertically and horizontally. And then we have our view here. We usually go ahead and add some text like this. You can say manual. And sometimes we add like text colors or background colors or custom fonts, whatever. Okay, so we usually do all of these things here. But what we're going to be doing in this video is we want to see how we can do this by code, right? So go ahead, delete that and jump right into our view controller. Now, the first thing we're going to do is to create our object. All right. So usually we are familiar with creating like constants of type integer where we say age, for example, and we put int. And then we usually maybe specify a particular age, maybe 339, right? So we're going to be doing this same thing, but this time we're not going to be creating an object or a constant of type integer, but a constant of a specific UI component, okay? In our case, let's go ahead and create a UI label, all right? So we can go ahead and specify UI label here, and we can come and say UI label, and then just open and close your bracket like this. And actually, since we're doing this, you don't need to specify a type. So this is going to create a label, and we can call this title label for this example. And just like that, as easy as this is, we have created a UI label, okay? But that's not all. Remember, when we create, so if you click on this and you do this, you have created a label. But there's still a couple of things that you need to do to make this label show up here. So the first thing you need to do is you need to add it to the view, right? So let's go to our view controller. And how do we do that? Very simple. We want to say view, which is where we want to add the label, dot add subview. And then we go ahead and specify the view that we want to add to the view. So in this case, we want to add the title label to our view. And this view is, you can think of as our screen, the page, this view controller page, all right? So that's it. This is going to add the title label to the view. But again, that's not all. Let's go back to our view storyboard, our storyboard, and click on this. Now we have this, we've brought it to the view and we've added it, but there's one more thing we need to do. We need to specify the position and the size of the view that we're going to be adding, right? So if we were to come over here and want to add this label right here, then we would say maybe the X value is going to be like 20 and the Y value be maybe like 100 or whatever, and it's going to be here, right? So let's try and do something like that. I'm going to go to our view controller, and here we're going to say title label, which is what we want to do, and we're going to specify the frame, okay? Now frame expects value of, since it doesn't want to show me, it expects value of type CG-rect. So here we're going to say CG-rect and open your bracket, and you can see that we have a couple of options. We need X, Y, width, and a height, okay? So we need to specify these values. Now, just like I mentioned, X is the distance along the X axis. So let's say maybe 20. So if this were our screen, X 20 from here will be somewhere here, right? And if it were 0, it would be at the extreme beginning. Then Y position is from the Y axis. So from here to here, so let's say maybe 100, I guess. Now for the width, you can go ahead and specify the width of your view, and I'm just gonna say 100 and maybe height is say 30, all right? So these are just like guesstimates, right? You can put whatever values you want, and it's going to look like that. So now we've done the main things. There's one more thing we usually do, which is adding constraints, but I'm going to hold off on that till later on in the video. All right. So now that we have this, let's actually go ahead and run this. And can you guess what's going to happen? I'll wait for you. So this is our app. It is loaded, but we don't see anything on the screen. Can you guess why? Well, the reason is very simple. We didn't add any text to the label, and the background is clear, so there's no evidence or visual evidence that this was added. So what we can do is say title label dot background color, and we can specify the background color to be blue. And then if I were to go ahead and run this again, we should see the title label right somewhere here. Awesome. So again, we can go ahead and say title label dot text and specify whatever text you want to pass in. I'm just going to pass in my name, and we run this again. We should see the text, and you can see that these are all the things we were doing in the storyboard. Oh, okay, so just go ahead and change the title, the text color, because black and blue. It's weird. So title label dot and text color. Just go ahead and say dot white, and we run it again. You're going to see how this is going to look even better. Okay, and if we want to add like corner radius, we can go ahead and say title label dot layer dot corner radius, and we can say maybe 5, and we run this again, and oh no, it didn't come. So let's actually clip that to bounds. So title label dot clips to bounds equals true. We run this again, and we should see a curve in all 4 corners. Ooh. Oh yeah, good. So you can see how we're able to basically just change the properties of the text field so easily, right? So programmatic UI isn't as difficult as we think. And so we have this created. Now, you can imagine that it's very possible and very easy for this to become very messy. So imagine that we have 5 more labels on the screen. We have text fields, like 5 text fields. We have 2 buttons. We have a couple of image views. And then we're just adding all these designs right here. It can become really messy really fast. So there are a couple of things that you can do to keep things cleaner. One of the things you can do is to, of course, take all of these and move them into a function and call this maybe setup title label, right? And we paste that in here, and here we just call the function setup title label. When we run this, we're gonna get the exact same thing, right? Comes up. Good. But there's something that we can do to make this even cleaner. And you'd actually find this if you're working in teams that have or do programmatic UI. So what they would often do is, rather than just creating this object like this and then configuring it in the body, they would go ahead and just specify this as a UILabel, which is of course what we want. And then right here, they just open curly brace and call this function like this. So this is basically going to give you a block where you can create your label and configure your label and then return this label into this constant, all right? And that's what we're gonna be doing here. So we're gonna cut all these things, and we're gonna come over here and we're gonna paste that, okay? So this is gonna be our title label, but we need to create our label right here, because we're not creating a label here, we're just specifying the type. So here we're gonna say let title label, and you can actually call this whatever you want, because this is within the scope. So I can decide to maybe just call this label like this, and then I'm going to have to replace all of these like that. So label is going to be equal to UILabel, and this is going to do all of the configurations, and here you can go ahead and return label. And then if we go ahead and we can actually just move this here if you want to, or you can keep the function if you want to, whichever one you feel like doing. And we can go ahead and run this. And when we do this, we should still see the label in the exact same corner. But this looks way cleaner because everything is kept within the block. So all of the configurations, or at least the initial configurations, are done here. So somewhere within the code, if you want to change some properties, you can do that, of course. So if you wanted to create more labels, you can go ahead and do more here, do more here, do more here, and whatever. But all of them are kept organized, okay? So that's it. Now there's one more thing that I want to point out, and don't feel pressure to, you don't need to be too bothered about this, but you'd often see it in like different code bases. And just to be clear, it doesn't only affect like UI components. It's used for way more cases, okay? And all of these warnings and too much talk that I've been doing is basically to introduce the lazy keyword. And the idea of the lazy keyword is to make sure that a particular object isn't loaded to memory until it's actually needed. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a demonstration just so you have a visual of what is happening. But we're not going to dwell so much on that. So here I'm just going to go ahead and say print label has been created. OK. So here we've created the label, and I'm not going to add this to the view. So let's say we're creating this label, but we don't need it just yet. Maybe we need it after some network calls or whatever. So we're not adding it just yet. So now I'm going to run this application. And just like that, you can see here, label has been created, but we don't need this, right? We don't need this now. So it shouldn't be added to the screen now, or added to the memory. So what we're going to do now, if we go ahead and add lazy over here, and we're going to need to change this to a var. When we do this and we run the application now, you're going to see that the label is not going to be created. So the app is running. If I scroll, you can see the label wasn't created. But if I were to go ahead and now use the label over here, so I'm going to add a print statement and say, I'm about to create the, or let's see, use the label. So now that I'm going to be accessing the label, then is going to be created and then added to the memory. So you can see I'm about to use the label, then I use the label, then the label was created. Okay. So this is one keyword that you're going to see quite a lot of times in like your code base. And just like I said, it doesn't only tie to like creating this. It is used for way more like other reasons that have to do with making sure that objects aren't loaded until they're needed. Okay, good. So we can just go ahead and remove this for simplicity's sake. And now the next thing I want to do is to talk about constraints. All right. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to add this label to the center of the screen. So let's just go ahead and remove this right here. And here we're going to say title label dot, and we can actually just modify the center property. So before we're modifying the frame, which specifies the position and the size. So now we're going to just modify the center, which is the position, and we're going to set the center to be view.center. But when we do this and run this, you're going to notice that the app is loaded, but we cannot see the label. And that's because there's no frame, there's no size specified for the label. So what we're going to do is just say title label dot, and we can actually say dot, what's it again? Frame dot size, good. And then this actually is of type CG size. And oftentimes when I don't know what type it is, it's either I just come and type it again and I see, okay, CG size, or I just come here and press dot and then I see initializers. So I can just go ahead and initialize with the width and the height. So the width 100 and the height of 30, just like we had before. So now if we go ahead and run this, it is going to place our title label at the exact center of the screen. Oops, it didn't. Oh, okay. Why? Oh, okay, so what is happening here is, if you look at this, we added the title label to the center of the screen, and then we modified the frame. So from the center, the width and the height was now drawn. That's why if you look here, you notice that this is the exact center of the screen, and then it drew the width and the height, okay? So what we can do to correct that is just to move this guy up. So specify the frame before we center this. And if we go ahead and run this again, we should see that hopefully this time, awesome. Now it's centered. Now there's one more thing we just want to do to keep this more pleasant to the eyes is to center the text. So here we're just going to say label dot text alignment and just say dot center. Now we'll go ahead and run this, and now the text within the label is going to be center aligned and is also center positioned. Great. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and rotate our device. Now you can see, oh my goodness, this guy just went off the screen, and that's not good. So I'm just going to bring it back. So we need to handle the rotation. And basically what we want to do is to set a constraint for this label to be in the center of the view, regardless of the alignment or the positioning of the orientation of the device, right? So how do we add constraints? Good. Now, before I get to constraints, there's actually a video I made talking about like constraints, and I'd highly recommend that you check it out, because constraints is a topic that if you don't get the basics, it can become quite frustrating or difficult for you to understand later on, all right? So just take a second or a while and just go ahead, watch that video, understand how constraints work. But as we learn how to do it programmatically, it's also going to give you or make you appreciate what is happening when you're working with constraints. Because I remember when I started out with iOS programming, there are oftentimes I would just click on my constraints and just click on the edges and just press enter, right? I don't even know what the constraints were added to. But when you're working programmatically, you have to be very much aware of what you're going to be adding your constraints to, okay? Now, about adding constraints, there are a couple of different ways that we can do this, all right? But I'm not gonna just go through all of them. I'm just gonna show you one way that we can do it, and maybe if we have some time, I'll show you other ways. But again, we wanna keep things simple. So, what do we wanna do? That's the first question we wanna ask. We want to center align the title label with the view, okay? So how do we do that? First of all, we're gonna say title label, which is what we wanna add the constraint to. And we're gonna say dot. Now, what kind of constraint do we want to add? We want to add center X. And center X simply means center horizontally. So on the X axis, right? We want to center X. We want to set constraints for the center X position, right? Now we add dot and say constraint, and there are a couple of options. So you can see we have equal to with constant, equal to system spacing, less than, greater than, blah, 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 blah. So I'm not gonna go through all of those, right? Remember, keeping things simple. So, but we're just gonna take this one, equal to. So we wanna specify or wanna add constraints. What type of constraint? Center X, which is like center horizontally. And we're adding this constraint, and we want this to be equal to what? So what do we want to set this constraint to? Because if we go back to our main.storyboard and let's go ahead and just add like a label right here. If we wanted to add a constraint and we click on this icon. Now, if you click here, you're going to see that we're adding a constraint to something. So we could add to the view or the safe area, whatever. Safe area is just like this point and not going past. So we are adding. So before we would just click on these things, but we didn't know exactly what was happening. But you can, of course, decide to add your constraints to certain objects. So this is going to be adding to the view. This is going to be adding to the view like that. Now, if I were to go ahead and drag a button to this place, all right? So we have a button here and I click on this. Now, if I click here, you can see that adding my right constraint, I could add my right constraint to this button, right? And that is if this button is selected. Or I could add it to the view and basically discard or disregard the button. And you can see that the value just changed. So if I were to say add it to the view at 30, right? And I just press enter. You can see that it just brought it straight here to the view. But if we were to add it to the button right here, so British action kicking it. So if we were to add it to the button like that, and I click on this, then it's going to add it to the button, all right? So that's just what I wanted to mention over here. Now, if we go here, what do we want to add our constraint to? We want to add it to the view. Now, what constraint of the view do we want to add it to, or do we want to make it equal to rather? So I want the center X, which is the middle of the title, to be the middle of the view. So what is the middle of the view? The middle of the view is center X anchor. Okay, so just to go over this one more time, we have our title label, which is the label that we have. Then we want to add a constraint. What constraint do we want to add? We want to add a constraint to the center. So we want to modify this or add center horizontally constraint. And we're setting this constraint to be equal to the view's center constraint. So this is basically going to put this guy and center align it to the middle of the view. Okay. Now, when you do this, your constraint is created, but it is not active. Now, there are a couple of things you can do. If you don't want to make your constraint active at this time, you can go ahead and assign this to a variable or a constant and say constraint, whatever. And then later on, so you can do this maybe globally somewhere in your right up here. And then later on, you can set it and make it active. But if you're not gonna need that and you just want the constraint to be set one time, you just come here, click on right dot and say is active and set this to be true. All right. So this is basically going to create the constraint and immediately set the constraint to be active. Right. So we're going to do the same thing. And now we're going to vertical align this. Can you guess how to do that? I'm sure you're smart enough to do that. So center align, but we're going to be doing Y anchor, and we're going to constraint this to the view dot center Y. And of course, you have to remember to make it active. So you just go ahead and say this. Okay. So now we can go ahead and run this, and we should have our view center aligned in our view. So nothing changes. I go ahead and rotate. Oops, nothing happens. And that's because we missed something else. Now, if you come over here, whenever you're modifying or messing with your constraints, it's always very important for you to turn off. So you're going to see translates auto resize and mask into constraints. And we're going to need to specify this as false. So now we go ahead and we run this one more time. And then I rotate the device, and then you can see that's right there. Okay. So this is something I usually forget. Where is it? This guy, I always forget to do it until I say, man, after 2 hours, why is this constraint not working? And then, yep, that's it. So yeah, it's very important for you to remember this. And you can see just like that, we've specified our constraint, and regardless of the orientation of the device or whatever kind of view you have, this is always going to be centered. Now, there's one more thing I'd like you to, I don't know if you noticed, is that the frame was basically updated or sort of disregarded. Not exactly disregarded, but you notice that when we didn't have the constraint, there was like some extra spacings right there, right? So, but now that we're using the constraints, it's basically using the size of the content for the label. So with that, we actually don't need to specify the frame. We actually don't need to specify the center. So this is basically just going to have the title and just clip it in. So here you can see that we still have it. And if I were to go to the main.storyboard just to give you a visual representation, this, what we currently have is the same thing we have when we just take a label, drag it in. So you know we don't specify a width and a height, we just say Emmanuel, we press enter, and then we hold down Control, click and drag, then we say center, horizontally, vertically, we click on that and just refresh the constraints, and it's just like that. So you see that we didn't have to specify a width or a height or even a position, because if I were to have this here and still add the constraints, it still would drag it right here and then clip. But if we wanted to have like a fixed width and a height, then we would come over here and say 100, and the height we can say maybe 40. And then this would happen, right? So we can do this exact same thing by code. So we just come over here and we're gonna add two more constraints. The first one we're gonna say is title label dot, and this time we wanna set the height, right? And this is going to be constraint equal to, and now I want this to be equal to a constant value. So I don't want this to be equal to any view's height, right? So I'm gonna select equal to constant. And for the height, we just say 30. Remember to set it active and just say true. And the same way we would specify the width and say width dot constraint, and the width we say 100, all right? Is active equals true. So I go ahead and run this, and now when the app launches, we should see some spaces there because we're adding constraint, okay? Now this is good. Now there's one more thing I want to show you right here is that if you notice, we've just been repeating ourselves and saying that true equals true, dot active is equal to true. Now there's something we can do to not always do this, which is to say ns layout constraint dot activate. And basically this allows us to be able to activate an array of constraints at the same time. So you just specify an array and just copy or paste or write all of your constraints that you want to activate. So just write that one, take this one like this, paste, like this, paste, one more, like this, paste. All right, so I will need to do all of these activations here. And now if we go ahead and run this, you'd notice that all of these constraints are still going to be applied, okay? So you can see that, I know at first this looks like, why do I need to do all of these things? This is so tiring and too much work. But it just makes you appreciate what exactly you're doing. And I'd actually recommend that you do it this way because you're more deliberate about what you're doing. You're not just pressing buttons without knowing exactly what is happening. And it actually will make you to be, basically you're gonna appreciate what you have in the UI, right? So you can just give this a try, play around with Programmatic UI for a couple of weeks. And yeah, but before we go, there's one more thing I want to show you with regards to constraints. And actually, just let me know, guys, if you want me to make more extensive videos about any portion of this particular tutorial, maybe talking about positioning, talking about like creating other views, because in this video, I only made a label, right? There are many other views that we can create programmatically. We're talking about like creating other view controllers and all those things, right? So just feel free, let me know in the comment section and I'll definitely, you know, consider making videos like that. Right? But the last thing I wanted to show you is that you can actually position your label to something else. So you don't always have to position to the center. You can decide to position to the top or to the bottom or to the left or to the right, right? So it's basically the same flow we have over here. So let's say, for example, I don't want this to be centered in the y-axis, right? And I want this to be centered, or rather to just be at the top. So I could just say title label dot top, so that's the top we want to do, and this is going to be constraint equal to the view dot top. Okay, now that's it. Now I can go ahead and run this, and you're going to see that this title is not going to be at the center this time, but it's going to be at the top of the view. And actually this is quite weird. It doesn't show, and the reason is we are constraining this to the top of the view. So I'm guessing, I'm maybe like 80% sure that it is somewhere behind this guy. So what we want to do is not just position to the top, but there are two things. We can position it to the top and add some constant, so not 0, because by default it's just going to add it to 0. So we want to add a constant of like 100, for example. And so we can do that by saying constant and say 100. Very simple. So now if we run this, it is going to constrain it to the top, but it's also going to add a constant value of 100. So now it is visible. Okay. So another thing we can do is not constrain this to the top, but just constrain it to the top of the safe area. So remember when we had this, when we were trying to add constraints, when we click on this, we saw the safe area right there. So we can do that here by saying view dot safe area layout guide, and then the top anchor. And now if we go ahead and remove this, so 0 by default, and we run this, this is going to position the title at the 0th point of the y-axis, just where the safe area is. All right. So that's just something I wanted to mention. Again, if you have questions, go ahead and leave it in the comment section. If you found any kind of value in this video and you haven't subscribed, go ahead and smash the subscribe button. And of course, please go ahead and like as well. Share with your friends if you want to. But yeah, if you have questions or you have recommendations of videos that you'd like to see in future, go ahead and let me know. And until then, you guys stay blessed.